Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully you all are having a wonderful day today. So I thought that I would review this little video. We're going to review a video by AKHi TV today. We're going to hear him talk about two of the best pound-for-pound fighters today. One in Seoul, Canelo Alvarez, and another one in Terence Crawford. We're going to see overall what he has to talk about it now. For those of you that know of new media and some LDBC channels, even though the LDBC channels, they more argue that Errol Spence is the number one pound-for-pound fighter because they are pro-PBC, even though they certainly also are pro-racial. And you'll notice that's a big part of the reason why they tear down Canelo Alvarez. New media also especially is very pro-racial. And the fighter that they've been trying to argue that has been the number one pound-for-pound fighter for the past couple of years has been Terence Crawford. And two of the fighters that they've had to tear down to try and prove that Terence Crawford is the number one pound-for-pound fighter. One of those fighters was Vasyl Lomachenko, and another one of those fighters, the most recent one, has been Canelo Alvarez. When it comes to Terence Crawford, there's really been one thing, in my opinion, that has kept him from the number one pound-for-pound spot, and that is his resume. I rank things, according to my pound-for-pound fighters, I rank things off of 4 categories. I rank it off of resume, accomplishments, dominance, and skill set. And I think Terence Crawford has an A grade in almost every single one of those categories because he is a phenomenal fighter. But when it comes to his resume, out of any top 10 pound-for-pound fighter today, he might have the weakest resume out of any top 10 pound-for-pound fighter today. And a certain amount of people may disagree. Maybe I would say if you were to have, I'm trying to think overall, who else would be in my top 10 pound-for-pound that might possibly have a weaker resume. Off the top of my head, I really can't think of one. Naoya Inoue possibly, but when it comes down to the overall, Terence Crawford, if he doesn't have the weakest resume as a top 10 pound-for-pound fighter, he's second to last. And in my opinion, you cannot be the number one pound-for-pound fighter in the world when you have never faced a top 10 pound-for-pound fighter in the world. Because all of the recent number one pound-for-pound fighters, or the ones that were in that conversation, have at least fought one top 10 pound-for-pound fighter, whether it be Vasyl Lomachenko facing Guillermo Rigondeaux, or Errol Spence Jr. facing Mikey Garcia, or Andre Ward facing a Carl Froch or Sergey Kovalev, or Canelo Alvarez facing a Gennady Golovkin, Floyd Mayweather Jr. facing a Manny Pacquiao, and, earlier on in his career facing a certain amount of others, Miguel Cotto, Diego Corrales, yada, 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 Ricky Hatton, those boys. So, this is my point. Terence Crawford, for him, allegedly, debatably being the number one pound-for-pound fighter, they claim that he is actually going to have a better resume than Canelo Alvarez. I'm curious to see how they're going to argue this, because to me, there really is no argument that Terence Crawford has a better resume than Canelo Alvarez, but let's see what they have to say.
On my last video, a lot of people said, oh, Oscar De La Hoya, when he said Crawford was pound for pound number one, he's salty, he this, he that. So is Morales salty? Is Marquez salty? Because Marquez...
Oscar De La Hoya, when it came down to it recently, he said that overall that Canelo Alvarez, he recently said that Terence Crawford is the number one pound for pound fighter in the world, or at least alluded to it. What is he supposed to say? Canelo Alvarez is no longer in his stable, and Virgil Ortiz is his fighter. Of course he's supposed to allege that Terence Crawford is the number one pound for pound, because if Virgil Ortiz gets a fight with Terence Crawford, and if he beats Terence Crawford, guess what? He can just claim that his fighter beat the most recent number one pound for pound. Why would he be promoting Canelo Alvarez and calling him the number one pound for pound fighter anymore when he's no longer his fighter? That's just common sense.
Said the same thing. And Canelo threatened Marquez. He wanted to fight Marquez.
And Marquez is jealous of Canelo Alvarez. And it's no disrespect against Juan Manuel Marquez. It's very clear whenever Juan Manuel Marquez talks about Canelo Alvarez, this dude does not like Canelo Alvarez. And Eric Morales, I'd have to do a little bit more research on the things that he said about Canelo. But I'm sure that all those Mexican legends are jealous of Canelo. Now, a certain amount of people may disagree. Let me tell you something. Besides Julio Cesar Chavez Sr., there's not been another Mexican fighter, in my opinion, that has been on the same level as Canelo Alvarez. There's never been another Mexican fighter in the history of boxing that could have been the number one pound for pound fighter. and a certain amount of people can disagree, but besides Julio Cesar Chavez Sr., there's never been another Mexican fighter on the level of Canelo Alvarez. That includes Marco Antonio Barrera, that includes Juan Manuel Marquez, that includes Eric Morales, that includes whoever else you want to mention, unless their name is Julio Cesar Chavez Sr. So it is what it is.
Marquez criticized Canelo. He gave him fair criticism. Out of nowhere, Canelo Alvarez, he wanted to fight Marquez. Instead of fighting the guys he was criticizing him.
But you don't fight Mexicans, Aki. You don't fight Mexicans.
But he fought a Mexican that started his career at 126, right? Either way you look at it with Canelo, it's a lose-lose situation because he cherry-picked so hard, his fans having a hard time defending him, right? Now,
I don't really think it's that hard to defend Canelo Alvarez at all. His next fight is going to be against Billy Joe Saunders, who's an A-class fighter. I really don't see how you can complain that much when it's an A-class fight. Now, once again, what new media and the LDBC love to allege, they love to allege that Canelo Alvarez is avoiding Charlo and avoiding Andrade and avoiding, he's taking the easy way out, when it comes down to it. I don't understand how Canelo Alvarez would be taking the easy way out because, to be honest with you, Billy Joe Saunders, Callum Smith, and Caleb Plant, they pretty much have the same credentials as a Jamal Charlo and a Demetrius Andrade. It would maybe be a little bit different if Jamal Charlo and Demetrius Andrade looked so much more dominant than these guys. But let's be real. Did you see Demetrius Andrade in his last fight? Did he look overtly impressive? Let's take a look at Jamal Charlo. Have we really seen him put on a performance of the year anytime recently? Take a look at his fight a few years ago against Matt Korobov. It's not like Jamal Charlo and Demetrius Andrade have never had shaky performances. I'm just really not understanding what puts them so far above Billy Joe Saunders or a Callum Smith or some of these other guys. Yeah, that's what new media tries to get you to believe. The truth is that Canelo Alvarez is fighting fighters on a very similar level.
The narrative out there, old media narrative that is, they always bring up the resume. They like, Canelo has the best resume.
You have to bring up the resume. The resume is the most important thing. It's always going to be the most important thing because anyone can look dominant. Anyone can look great against B and C class fighters. But you're really going to be expressed on how great of a fighter you are when you face A-class fighters. And when we take a look at Canelo Alvarez's resume, no matter how many controversial decisions you think that there has been, he's beaten Arasani Lara, he's beaten Gennady Golovkin, he's beaten Miguel Cotto at a good point in his career, he beat Sergey Kovalev still at a decent point in his career, he beat Callum Smith, he beat Danny Jacobs, he beat Austin Trout. All those guys at the time, and were later on proven to be A-class fighters.
In boxing. That's why he's pound for pound number one. What I'll say is, what happened to that resume talk when they put Lomachenko number one when he had 8 fights over Andre Ward and Terence Crawford? Remember that?
Well, overall, that's great, Aki, but that has nothing to do with Canelo Alvarez. So basically you're bringing up something that's pretty much irrelevant. I mean, the Vasyl Lomachenko, were there some people that were ranking Vasyl Lomachenko as the number one pound-for-pound fighter way too early on? Yes. Now, in my opinion, Lomachenko, did he deserve to be ranked number one pound-for-pound after a while? Yeah. Once he defeated Jorge Linares, in my opinion, he had the resume, he had the dominance, he had the skill set, he had everything to be ranked as the number one pound-for-pound fighter. But obviously, he can't be that any longer because he recently lost to Teofimo Lopez. And I had Canelo Alvarez at number 2 ever since he defeated Gennady Golovkin in that rematch. Terence Crawford has been a number 3 or number 4 for a couple of years now for me.
Remember when Teddy Atlas said, based on the eye test, Andre Ward and Terence Crawford were looking at him like, you for real? What happened to that resume talk when they erased Lomachenko, lost, and put him on top of Terence Crawford and Canelo Alvarez?
Okay, that's fine, Aki. You can basically criticize those fighters, but the bottom line is this. If you're going to put Terence Crawford above a Canelo Alvarez for that, you're basically going to be doing the same thing that the Lomachenko fans did back then. You'd basically be being a hypocrite.
But out of nowhere, as soon as Lomachenko loses, now it's all about resume. And Canelo bypassed Terence Crawford to the number 1 slot.
Well, here's the problem, Aki. And I understand the point that you're bringing up, but let's not sidestep this fact. Lomachenko, when he was beating certain fighters, was beating greater fighters than what Terence Crawford was facing. Let's be real. Does Terence Crawford have a win in his career like what Lomachenko has over Guillermo Rigondeaux? Let's be honest, how many fights in Terence Crawford's career are even on the level of a Nicholas Walters? Or on the level of a Jorge Linares when Jorge Linares was at his best? Jorge Linares was a very tough, and at the time, the best 135-pounder in the world. You can say whatever you want about Lomachenko, but Lomachenko, within less than 20 fights, has fought more A-class fighters and more top 10 pound-for-pound fighters than Terence Crawford has within damn near 40 fights. And a certain amount of people ain't gonna like that. But that's the truth on Terence Bud Crawford.
When Terence was the number one pound for pound all along, right? So we're going to entertain this resume talk because I really want to talk about it with the Canelo fans. For the same people that rate Canelo as number one due to his resume, it's so hypocritical to not have Sean Porter on your top 10 pound for pound. The same people
Top
that
two,
say...
we talking about resume.
Well, the same...
Well, the resume overall, when it comes down to it, is very important. But you also have to have the skill set, you have to have the dominance, you have to have the accomplishments. And Canelo Alvarez... Canelo Alvarez is not just the number one pound for pound fighter because of his resume. Once again, you have to rank off of everything. It's like the LeBron James and Michael Jordan conversation. It's like when those idiots try to rank LeBron James over Michael Jordan because, well, take a look at the statistics. You have to rank everything. And basketball is a completely different situation. Statistics can look different depending on the system that you play in the era, so we're not going to get into all of that. But you can't look at things two-dimensionally. You have to take a look at every facet. And that's a very one-dimensional way of looking at things. You can't just take a look at the resume. Terence Crawford is a top 10 pound-for-pound fighter, make no mistake about it, because he has an A grade in every category that I rank by besides resume. The problem is that Canelo Alvarez has an A grade, maybe even an A+ grade, in every single category that I rank.
People that say Canelo Alvarez is pound for pound number one because of his resume, they don't even rate Sean Porter. When Sean Porter have arguably the deepest resume in boxing, from Alexander...
Okay, but he's also lost a certain amount of his big fights. You're talking about a guy overall that had a close fight with Danny Garcia, lost to Errol Spence Jr., lost to Keith Thurman, and lost to Kell Brook. He's not going to be a top 10 pound-for-pound fighter. On top of that, he has no belts. He's a one-division champion. He has no belts at this current time. What is going to make Sean Porter a top 10 fighter in boxing? It's not just about the resume. It's how also you keep up the dominance and the skill set. The problem is with Terence Crawford is that, of course, he's extremely dominant. But when it comes down to it, he has no A-grade resume. You have to have a resume, but keep being dominant. Now, this argument maybe would make a little bit more sense if you were going to argue Manny Pacquiao over Canelo Alvarez. But even that would not work because when it comes to the pound-for-pound spot, you have to have recent dominance. And that's the problem. Canelo Alvarez, when it comes to recent dominance, there is no one who is more recently dominant than the Canelo Alvarez.
To Adrian Broner, Kell Brook, Errol Spence, Keith Thurman, Ugas, all these fighters. I could go on and on and on. He fought all these fighters. Danny Garcia in their prime. And
Sean Porter, in my opinion, would be a top 20 pound-for-pound fighter. But you cannot be a top 10 pound-for-pound fighter with the dominance overall that Sean Porter has had lately, and with no belts, and with you only being a one-division champion. That's a very stupid way to look at things. No offense, but that's just dumb.
Nobody have him on their pound-for-pound list. So what's your take on all this resume talk? The same people that say Canelo is number one because of his resume are the same people that don't rate Sean Porter as a pound-for-pound fighter. And mind you, if Sean Porter was Mexican, I promise you, he probably would have won majority of the close fights he had, like the fight with Keith Thurman. The way he fight...
Maybe he won the Keith Thurman fight, but he did not win the Kell Brook fight. He clearly did not win the Errol Spence fight. That fight really was not that close, and neither was the Kell Brook fight. So no, Sean Porter is not a top 10 pound-for-pound fighter. You have to have recent dominance in your career to be a top 10 pound-for-pound fighter. Now, Sean Porter, if he were to have one or two of the belts in the welterweight division right now, he probably could be a top 10 pound-for-pound fighter, but he has no belts when it comes down to it. And to be honest, I'm not sure if Sean Porter's really ever been a top 10 pound-for-pound fighter on my list, because he's lost a certain amount of the bigger fights in his career, and I'm not sure if he's ever held two belts at one point in time. Maybe I'm wrong about that. Someone correct me if I'm wrong. But anyway.
Mexican style, he will have won majority of them fights, just like Canelo. Canelo lost to Lara. Canelo arguably lost to Triple G twice. Canelo had a close fight with Trout. These are the prime fighters he fought. And he arguably lost to all three of them. We know he lost to a grandpa version of Floyd Mayweather. So, if we...
That's great, but Floyd Mayweather Jr. was the number one pound-for-pound fighter. And there's a lot of people that thought that he lost to Lara. I thought he could have lost to Lara. And I've had a couple of people in my comment section disagree with me on that because they say, well, Lara wasn't doing nothing but running. I'm not really here to say that. I'm not really one to call a fighter a runner unless they truly are running, like what Adrian Broner did in the Manny Pacquiao fight. I don't consider what Lara did in the Canelo Alvarez fight running. I don't consider what Floyd Mayweather Jr. does running. I consider that aggression on the back foot. But it is what it is. Anyway, when it comes down to it, whatever you want to say, Lara, you can argue, certainly could have threw more in that Canelo Alvarez fight. And Golovkin, in my opinion, lost the second fight against the Canelo Alvarez. And Triple G was looked at as a top 5 pound-for-pound fighter in the world. Sean Porter, if your argument is that he should be somewhere near on the same level as a Canelo Alvarez, what fighter has he defeated that would be looked at on the same level as a Gennady Golovkin on the pound-for-pound list?
Talking about resume, why is Sean Porter not in the conversation? Why the same people that rate Canelo as number 1 because of his resume don't rate Sean Porter as a top 10, which is so hypocritical on their end?
It's not hypocritical, you're just stupid. Because when it comes down to it, no one's going to rank Sean... Why would you rank Sean Porter as a top 10 pound-for-pound fighter? Once again, you're talking about a guy that has no belts right now, who's lost the majority of the big fights in his career, when it comes down to it, officially. Has no belts right now when it comes down to it. And compared with recent dominance, he's not been as dominant as a Canelo. He's not been as dominant as a Terence Crawford. He's not been as dominant as an Errol Spence Jr. So when it comes down to it, dominance and skill set are going to come into it. Dominance is probably going to be ahead of skill set. But when it comes down to it overall, the resume is going to be the most important thing. Make no mistake about it. But if you've lost the majority of the big fights in your career, you cannot be placed above a fighter that has a weaker resume than you even on that pound-for-pound list. The thing is with Canelo Alvarez is that he, even against the stronger fighters in his career, he usually wins the majority of those fights, whether you want to say they're controversial or not.
What's your take on that?
Now, when we talk about resumes, these people got to be very careful what they mean. Because if we're talking about the best resume in boxing, it's not even Canelo Alvarez. Because there's still an active fighter in boxing. Even though he's old, even though he's 42, he's got a way better resume than Canelo ever has or probably even ever will at the rate he's going.
I'm not going to say Manny Pacquiao has a way greater resume than Canelo Alvarez ever will. Because there's a certain amount of fights where Manny Pacquiao kind of fought at a catchweight or did not fight welterweight fighters at their 100% official best. So it is what it is. But when it comes down to it, what I will say is this. Manny Pacquiao, when you talk about it in terms of all-time great resume, yes, he does overall have a greater resume than Canelo Alvarez in my opinion, but this is where the recent dominance comes in. If you have both great resumes, and it depends on what you've done really for the past several years or what you've done for the past couple of years. And when we take a look at the resume for the past couple of years, Canelo Alvarez not only has a better resume than Manny Pacquiao, he's been more dominant than a Manny Pacquiao. So once again, you have to take a look at everything.
So if we're talking about resumes, are you talking about current or overall?
Because
If we're talking about overall, Pacquiao beats Canelo.
Exactly.
Yeah, we can talk about Pacquiao. Because I don't even see Pacquiao at the pound-for-pound list anymore.
So you believe that Manny Pacquiao is the number 1 overall pound-for-pound fighter? You're saying that overall he has the greatest resume. So you're saying that those people should rank Manny Pacquiao as the number 1 overall pound-for-pound fighter. Once again, that's just taking a look at one category. And that's what these people don't seem to understand. They're taking a look at Terence Crawford and they're saying, wow, this guy seems to be the most skilled fighter in the world. I have to rank him as the number 1 pound-for-pound fighter. And I get that to a degree. But you have to take a look at everything. Once again, it's a lot like when the LeBron James fans take a look at things very one-dimensionally and they just take a look at his statistics and say, wow, LeBron James averages more assists, he averages more rebounds. He must be greater than Michael Jordan. That's completely disassociating the MVPs, the championships, the playing styles, all this other stuff. These guys are taking a very flatline look approach to this.
If you're talking about resume, because Pacquiao beats Canelo's resume 10 times out of 10. We're talking about him fighting the best of the best pound for pound in their prime. But we see Canelo fighting Avni Yildirim, and I see ESPN saying that his win with Yildirim put him over Terence Crawford. And I see Canelo fans saying, he had to fight Yildirim. It was his mandatory. Yet if you see a Terence Crawford fight Kavalauskas, who's an undefeated top contender, who was also Terence Crawford's mandatory, they'll say, he's fighting a bum.
And Olympic.
Terence Crawford.
Aegis Kavalauskas was a C-class fighter. And a certain amount of people are not going to like that. Aegis Kavalauskas is a very unproven fighter, and you notice that he's not touched the top 10 rankings ever again once he lost to Terence Crawford. It is what it is. The fighters that Canelo Alvarez is facing, are real deal fighters. He's facing Ring Magazine fighters. He's facing fighters that at times are ranked in the top 10 pound for pound, or that have been impactful in multiple weight classes, like a Danny Jacobs, like a Billy Joe Saunders, like a Callum Smith, like a Gennady Golovkin. Terence Crawford is facing no names like Aegis Kavalauskas and Jose Benavidez. Like, come on, give me a damn break.
Yeah,
exactly.
And that's a great point you brought up. It's funny because if Crawford fought an Avni Yildirim, a fighter coming off a loss and 2-year layoff, they will have trashed Terence Crawford. They will have removed him from the pound-for-pound list just for that cherry pick, right? But Canelo...
Well, he pretty much is facing people that are on the level of Avni Yildirim, Aki. People like Aegis Kavalauskas and Jose Benavidez, let's be real, they're not too far behind those type of opponents. So it is what it is. I mean, let's be real. How great are those opponents? Terence Crawford has really been facing B and C class fighters for the majority of his career, whether people like that or not.
It's okay. He could do whatever he wants. And they asked the question, who can beat Canelo after he just beat Avni Yildirim? And they try to justify it with the mandatory talk, but the same people that want to claim Canelo fought Avni because that's his mandatory, they the same people that try to justify Canelo ducking Jamal Charlo when Jamal was Canelo mandatory and Canelo gave up the belt. You're a fake champion if you got to give up the belt in order to protect a record that's not even...
Yes, just like Jamal Charlo is a fake fighter for calling out all these guys and not being serious about fighting them. Anyway.
Perfect. Like Canelo Alvarez did with Jamal Charlo. The man gave up his belt. We're not even going to talk about him failing a drug test, testing positive for steroids twice against Gennady Golovkin. We're not even going to bring that to the table. That's a fact, too, but we're just going to stick to the boxing talk of Canelo Alvarez. They want to justify him being pound-for-pound #1 because he got the best resume. But like you said, Manny Pacquiao...
Here's the problem. Canelo doesn't just have the best resume when it comes to most recent fighters in their prime. He's also been the most dominant fighter within probably the past 5 years, at least debatably now with Vasily Lomachenko's recent loss. He is up there with anyone in terms of skill set, and in terms of dominance, he's up there with anybody. And in terms of accomplishments, meaning how many belts you've won and how many weight classes you've won in, he also can compete with them. It might be a little bit different if Canelo Alvarez is only a champion in one weight class, but that's not the case.
Yeah, he just beat a Keith Thurman. Not an Avni Yildirim, a Keith Thurman at 30 years old, in his prime. They don't say Manny Pacquiao is #1 because of his resume. He's still active, right?
Because Manny Pacquiao does not fit all the categories. Canelo Alvarez, once again, when you take a look at every single category, he has an A grade. Manny Pacquiao, he has an A grade in some of them, but in most recent years, I can't say that he has an A grade in dominance. He had a little bit of a slip-up against Jeff Horn a couple of years ago. Now, of course, a lot of people thought that was a bad decision. I personally thought it was a close fight.
Do any of the last 3 opponents that Canelo fought, are any of them on Keith Thurman's level? I would like to hear Canelo fans argue that.
Absolutely not. But we all know they from...
No, they may not be on Keith Thurman's level, but Gennady Golovkin was above a Keith Thurman on the pound-for-pound list, whether you guys like to admit that or not. Was Keith Thurman ever a top 5 pound-for-pound fighter?
Europe. When they say Canelo is pound-for-pound #1, they mean Canelo is Europe pound-for-pound #1 because he's on a Europe tour as we speak. Canelo said out of his own mouth...
Now, what did AKHi TV just say there? They mean that Canelo Alvarez is the Europe #1 pound-for-pound. What is he basically saying? He's saying overall that Canelo Alvarez is ranked #1 pound-for-pound because he is a Caucasian Hispanic. And I've been telling people what their motivations have been for a very long time. And once again, AKHi TV exposes his narrative. That is the reason why they like to put Terence Crawford as the #1 pound-for-pound fighter. No other reason.
I'm not going to fight any more Mexican fighters as soon as he moved up to David Benavidez's division. Well, he fights Chavez, and he wanted to fight Marquez, but all of a sudden, when we want to see him fight an undefeated Mexican who can actually fight his ass off, David Benavidez, now he waving the white flag. Oh, I'm not going to fight my people. How can you be the best in the world when you don't even want to fight the best in your division? When he don't want...
That's great, AKHi, and it'd be a little bit different if Terence Crawford was fighting the best in his division. The problem is, Terence Crawford ain't fighting the best in his division. He's fighting he's fighting the Avni Ildrims in his divisions repeatedly. Canelo Alvarez is fighting multiple A-class fighters. Every Avni Ildrim and Rocky Fielding that Canelo Alvarez fights, he has 2 A-class fights in a row. Whether you guys like to admit that or not. Billy Joe Saunders is an A-grade fight. You know, Callum Smith was an A-grade fight. You know, Caleb Plant, if he fights him this year, is an A-grade fight. Alright, so it is what it is.
To fight the most dominant races in boxing. The Black American fighters and the Mexican fighters.
Yes, but when you take a look at the pound-for-pound list right now, AKHi, and when you take a look overall at the weight classes, it's not just 100% dominated overall purely by, you know, black athletes or overall, you know, even Latino athletes. There's a lot of mixture in between them. There's a lot of variety. And when you talk about Canelo Alvarez's weight classes, it's very mixed. You have David Benavidez there. You have Callum Smith there. You have Billy Joe Saunders there. You have Caleb Plant there. You have Demetrius Andrade there. Jamal Charlo there. Right now, those are pretty much the more dominant ones that Canelo Alvarez has not fought. And he's facing Billy Joe Saunders next. So personally, I don't have a big problem with it.
Charlo and Andrade, he's been ducking for the past 7 years to the state. Canelo Alvarez was never #1 in any division he campaigned in.
That's not true. But of course, that's the narrative overall that they try to campaign. Canelo Alvarez has been #1 in almost every division that he's ever been in. At least the ones that he's won belts in. Now, of course, when Floyd Mayweather was around, Floyd Mayweather was the #1 154-pounder when he defeated Canelo Alvarez. But once Floyd Mayweather Jr. retired, then you would have had to say that Canelo was the best 154-pounder. Certainly became the best 160-pounder when he defeated Gennady Golovkin. And right now, you would have to rank him as the best 168-pounder. So it is what it is.
154. He lost to Lara and Floyd. And ducked Andrade and both of the Charlo brothers. He moved up to 160. He avoided Charlo and Andrade yet again. Now at 168, he ducking David Benavidez. And he's on a Europe tour. He had a plan of becoming undisputed at 160. He gave up on the plan when Charlo and Andrade won belts in his division. And then obviously he moved up to 168 to become...
Right, but you know what? Let me ask you this, AKHi. Because you always make it a big deal that Terence Crawford unified the 140-pound division. Let me tell you this. Canelo Alvarez unifying this 168-pound division is 10 times more the accomplishment than what Terence Crawford did at 140. Because let's be real. I mean, shit. You want to talk about the European tour that Canelo Alvarez is going on. Let's talk about overall the Caribbean and European tour that Terence Crawford took to beat, you know, those weaklings at 140 pounds. Let's be real, man. How many A-class fighters did Terence Crawford beat to unify that division? Is Julius Ndongo an A-class fighter? Just answer me that question. Is Victor Postal definitively an A-class fighter? What about Thomas Delorme, where Terence Crawford won the vacant belt? Is Thomas Delorme, has he, you know, the one who just lost to a prospect in his last fight? You know, is that an A-class fighter? Those are the fighters that Terence Crawford beat to unify that division. And don't get me wrong, I give him credit. It takes a lot to unify a division. But that was not a very strong division. Like, just cut the crap.
Undisputed now because the division is full of European fighters. But I do want to talk about this, and you could correct me on this. Wasn't Crawford #1 at 135 before he moved up?
Yeah, he was, because he beat them.
He certainly was. He was #1 at 135, and he was #1 at 140. But you're trying to spread the narrative that Canelo Alvarez has never been #1 in a certain division. Well, for those of us that look at things logically and objectively and know what's going on, we all know that that's a case of bullshit. But it is what it is.
Lineal champion.
And nobody wanted to fight him after that. So
No.
after he beat Gamboa, he moved up. Wasn't Crawford #1 at...
But you notice overall that Terence Crawford, they won't say that Terence Crawford debatably is not #1 in this division, even though he turned down a Sean Porter fight about a year ago. Anyway.
At 140?
Yeah, because he beat every champion at 140.
Thank you.
Even though they said he was afraid of Victor Postal, and then he beat the crap out of Victor Postal.
And after he beat the crap out...
Well, we all know these European fighters, as you guys love to say, don't deserve no damn respect. So that should be counted as just going on the European tour.
Out of him, he supposedly cherry picked him. And then at 147, who is number one right now?
Number one right now is Errol Spence Jr. No question about it.
147, who's number one right now? I say Errol Spence. But that's the same
Crawford,
guy Terence Crawford's been calling out.
For how long?
For 2 to 3 years.
Exactly. That's exactly my
point. He's stuck at him.
So basically what their argument is that Terence Crawford, since allegedly he's Smoke City, he's serious about getting all the smoke. This is what they allege. Apparently Terence Crawford is number one pound for pound. Is Terence Crawford really serious about taking these fights? Would he have not signed with the PBC if he was truly serious about taking these fights? Would he be serious about taking Errol Spence? If he were serious, wouldn't he take a 60-40 split? When Floyd Mayweather Jr. was serious about facing Oscar De La Hoya, didn't he realize that Oscar De La Hoya was the bigger star at the time? Now, that's not going to be as big of a differential between Errol Spence and Terence Crawford as it was with Floyd and Oscar De La Hoya at the time. But when it comes down to it, didn't Floyd realize that Oscar was the bigger star, and because he wanted to face him, he gave Oscar the purse split, the majority of the purse split? That's what Terence Crawford is going to have to do. And I'm sorry, I don't want to hear this bullshit of, oh, 60-40 just ain't going to cut it. I need 50-50. Terence, you ain't going to get shit along those lines. Because you decided to sign with Top Rank and face B and C class fighters.
As soon as he moved up to the division, he told Errol Spence, what's up? You say you the smoke? That's my nickname. He said, I am the smoke. And he wanted...
That's my nickname, Smoke City. Just don't ask me to come to your own promotion. Please, dude.
Fight Errol Spence right away, as soon as he moved up to the division. Do you see Canelo moving up to 168 and wanting to fight David Benavidez right away? Nah, he wanted to fight Rocky Fielding. David Benavidez, they reached out to Canelo Alvarez team twice, and Canelo team turned it down.
That's great if you want to mention that. The problem is that Canelo Alvarez is facing fighters that are somewhere near on the same level as the David Benavidez. Whether people agree with that or not.
David Benavidez lost his belt on the scale. Canelo was knocking the door on Suleiman, wanting to fight Avni Yildirim. You see, Crawford, he wanted to fight Errol Spence right away. Errol Spence, he wanted to save him last because he views Crawford as his most dangerous rival and threat because that's the fight of the decade, right? That's not Crawford's fault. But the point that I'm trying to make is, even without Errol Spence, Crawford fought Jeff Horn, who gave Pacquiao a hell of a fight. I had Pacquiao winning, but I still believe Jeff Horn.
It don't even matter if you think Pacquiao won or lost. Crawford beat Horn on a way easier scale.
Knocked him out.
It don't matter, exactly.
That's great, but let's be real. Manny Pacquiao in that fight, I think in all honesty, did not take Jeff Horn very seriously. And that's not me trying to make excuses. But I think Jeff Horn got off a little bit lucky in that fight. But that loss is a part of the reason, because that was a close fight. That loss is a part of the reason why I can't have Manny Pacquiao in my top 5 right now, or at least within my top 4.
He beat Amir Khan. It dominated him. He didn't lose.
And Amir Khan, that was a B-class fighter at that point. And now, isn't that interesting? When Vasyl Lomachenko was the number 1 pound-for-pound fighter, what did AKHi TV always say about him? Man, he's beating people's leftovers. Man, he beat Nicholas Walters coming off of a draw. Man, he beat Guillermo Rigondeaux off of a layoff. Man, he beat overall, these guys, Mikey Garcia leftovers, Roman Martinez. But when Amir Khan gets knocked out 3 times in his career, and Kell Brook gets knocked out a couple of times, never looks the same again, what does he say about Terence Crawford? Well, take a look at the fighters that he's beat. Like, come on, man.
Lose the first 4 rounds like Canelo did. He didn't lose the first 4 rounds like Canelo did. He made him quit, like you said. And then he obviously beat Mean Machine. Undefeated Benavidez.
Did he just say that Canelo Alvarez lost the first 4 rounds against Amir Khan? Once again, I'm very glad that AKHi TV is not a judge, because we'd see another Adelaide Bird up in there. This man should never legally be allowed to judge a boxing fight ever. I hope he never gets a judging license. Because, dear God.
Everybody told Crawford, you ducking Benavidez. Crawford fought him. Even Kell Brook. So if you look at Crawford's resume at 147, if we compare him to an Errol Spence, the only 2 names that he has that's really making him stand out at this moment in time is Sean Porter and Danny Garcia.
Dude, Kell Brook was done when Terence Crawford fought him. Don't even try to play that game. Kell Brook had lost already twice by knockout. Kell Brook was broken down. His soul was taken after he lost to Errol Spence Jr. He was never the same fighter after that. He never fought the same after that. And if you were to watch his fights, you would know what the hell I'm talking about. He was never the same after that fight. He was a completely done fighter. All right, it is what it is. But once again, AKHi TV, he'll say this was Sergey Kovalev and Canelo Alvarez. He has no problem alleging that Sergey Kovalev was a completely done fighter when Canelo Alvarez fought him. But when Terence Crawford fights a completely washed up version of Kell Brook, oh, well, he fought a very good version of Kell Brook. Like, get the fuck out of here with that shit, man. Sergey Kovalev, when he fought Canelo Alvarez, was not the same fighter, but he was a much better fighter at that point in time in his career than what Kell Brook was when he fought Terence Crawford. That's just the facts of the matter.
Arguably, Sean Porter could possibly be Terence Crawford's next fight. So they have almost the same resume at 147. So what are we even talking about?
No, they don't almost have the same resume at 147. It's not even close. Come on. What are you talking about? Danny Garcia at the time was one of the top 5 welterweights in the world, and he dominated him. Sean Porter was one of the top 5 welterweights in the world, and he dominated. And Kell Brook was looked at by many people as the number 1 welterweight in the world. He was coming off of a loss to Gennady Golovkin, but at least had a little bit of a shred of greatness in him left. You know, the only shred of greatness he had in him left, and Errol Spence was able to knock him out. And then he beat Mikey Garcia. Like, the resumes are not even close. Like, what are you even talking about?
Canelo never been number 1 in any division he campaigned in. He always ducked the best in every division he campaigned in. However, Crawford, on the other hand, he challenged Vasyl Lomachenko. He challenged Errol Spence and any major...
So it's great that you challenged Vasyl Lomachenko, who's a natural 130-pounder, and Terence is a natural 147-pounder. Nice.
That was viewed as the best in his division. So that's why I rate Terence Crawford as pound-for-pound number 1, hands down.
Well, your
Windows drafty?
Well, your ranking system is flawed. And that's really all I got to say about this video today.
Broken? Are your energy bills on the rise? The Champion family is here to help you stay comfortable.
Hold it, you're not that pretty.
Anyways, that's really about it for today's video. I just wanted to see how they would justify Terence Crawford being the number 1 pound-for-pound fighter. Pretty much just what I guessed. A bunch of delusion. But it is what it is. Anyways, in my opinion, Canelo Alvarez remains the number 1 pound-for-pound fighter. When you take a look at an athlete, when you're ranking things, it doesn't even matter if you're ranking boxers. You know, sometimes I talk about football, sometimes I talk about basketball. If we were to have a conversation about Michael Jordan and LeBron James, and you were to tell me why I believe that LeBron James is above Michael Jordan because, you know, he's the more complete player, take a look at how many assists and rebounds he averages. You'd be completely disregarding how they play and overall why they may look like that. We have to take a look at things and say, why are they like that? And these guys, they're looking at it very one-dimensionally. They're taking a look at it, saying that Terence Crawford, oh, well, he's more dominant. You know, he looks more skilled, all sort of stuff. Okay, well, why does he look more dominant? Why does he look more skilled? Is it really because he's the all-around better fighter than Canelo Alvarez? Or is it because he's not really facing that elite competition? That's the bottom line. So you have to really think about these things all around and, you know, unbiased and overall in an intelligent way. And AKHi TV, in my opinion, just does not do that. But anyways, that's really about it for today. Thanks so much for watching. I'll talk to you all later.